Well, most of us, at one point in our lives or another, have found ourselves longing for news that is too good to be true. So this Tuesday, I will face my final ordination interview, and Lord willing, and they pass me, I will be ordained at this year's annual conference on Tuesday, May 31st, 7 o'clock at the Hilton Americas downtown, so consider this all your formal invitation. I would love for you all to be there, pending, of course, my interview on Tuesday, so send up some prayers Tuesday afternoon for me, and I greatly appreciate that. But 8 years ago, I was just starting this journey. I was still discerning my first steps into ministry. And I had started taking classes at the Houston-Galveston program of Perkins School of Theology. And after about a year, I had discerned that it was time to move to Dallas to finish my coursework. And so as I thought about this move and planned this move, there were a lot of questions that were weighing on my mind. Questions like, how am I going to pay for tuition? Where am I going to work, and how am I going to balance work and taking classes? Oh my gosh, where am I going to live? And the most important question that always seems to weigh us down in life, how am I going to pay for it all? And so I have been sharing these questions with friends and family of mine, and one night I got a phone call from my best friend Kelly, who lives in Dallas, and she had just gotten married the year before, and I was the maid of honor in her wedding. And she called me and she said, Emily, well, Matt and I have a proposal for you, but please, we will not be offended if you say no. We understand. We just want to put it out there for you because we know you've been struggling with this move and where you're going to live. And we just bought a house and we were wondering, why don't you just live with us? Free of charge. We have an extra room. We won't charge you rent. You can live with us as long as you're in seminary. Let this be our gift to you to support your future ministry. And then she immediately continued on with, but we do live about 30 minutes away from the campus, so if you don't want to live with us and you want to find a place closer to campus, we'll totally understand. And I have to tell you, I did not hear a word she said after she said, do you want to live with us? Because in my mind, I was already doing leaps for joy, because not only was it free rent, which in and of itself is an amazing, amazing gift, but also I was thinking, I get to live with two of my favorite people in the entire world. And there was a split second after she asked me that I thought, this is too good to be true. Even coming from my best friend who I know would do anything for me and who I know I would do anything for, there was still that moment where I thought, oh my gosh, could it really work out that well? Could God and the universe and life really be that generous with me that this could actually work? And God really is that generous, because I spent the next 3 years living with Matt and Kelly throughout seminary and had some of the best experiences of my life being their surrogate daughter during that time. And I will tell you today, I would not have been able to make it through seminary without their help. And so I left in July actually of 2012 to go do my internship, and ironically enough, 9 months later, my room was turned into a nursery. So timing is impeccable at times, but I brought some pictures of Matt and Kelly to show you because I just love them and I want you to see who they are. So this is them. This is the three of us at a wedding at some point during the time that I lived with them. And then the next picture is a picture of Kelly and I on my graduation day from seminary. So Lord willing, they will also be at my ordination in May. But the truth is that all of us find ourselves in these moments where we are hoping against hope for news that is so good, it is actually unbelievable. And most of the time we find ourselves in these moments when we're actually really struggling with something at a very deep level in our lives. Maybe for some of us, it's a miraculous health diagnosis after a long struggle with illness. Or maybe for some of us, there is a relationship in your life that you know is broken beyond repair, and yet something deep inside of you still longs to be able to put it back together again. Some of us may be longing for a second chance, a missed opportunity that we know will probably not come again. We all long for this news that is too good to be true, and I would venture to say that even if we got the news we were looking for, there would still be a moment. There would still be that instant of doubt where we thought, man, when is the other shoe going to drop? Is it really possible that life could be this good? Because when everything in your life up until now has told you one thing, and then suddenly you are presented with a different reality, it can be really hard to move our thinking from doubt to belief. So as you know, last Sunday we celebrated Easter, which is arguably one of the most important and celebrated dates in the Christian calendar. And yet I'm struck with how different our experience of Easter today is than it was for all the disciples all of those years ago. Because today we celebrate Easter with pomp and circumstance and alleluias and Easter lilies and beautiful dresses. In fact, our entire experience of Holy Week and Good Friday is specifically shaped by the fact that we already know how the story ends. We already know Sunday is coming. And yet for the disciples all those years ago, that was not the case. And so when we find them on that Sunday after Jesus' death, we don't find them shouting hallelujahs. We find a group of friends that is deeply immersed in grief. We find a group of people who have just witnessed a horrific tragedy and don't know how to make sense of it and don't know what to do next. And even though Jesus spent a good chunk of his ministry predicting his death and trying to prepare his disciples to the best of his ability for what would come next, and even in John, we see these 3 or 4 chapters where Jesus is saying goodbye to his disciples, and he says things like, I am going away to prepare a place for you, but I will come back for you. Even after all of this, the disciples still didn't get it. So in John chapter 20, we read the first stories of what happened early on that Sunday morning. We read about Mary Magdalene going to the tomb and seeing the stone rolled away, and how she ran to get Peter and the disciple that Jesus loved so that they could come and see for themselves. And then we read this beautiful and tender encounter between Mary and Jesus where she recognizes him for the first time, and she herself receives news that is simply too good to be true. And yet, even after Mary goes and tells the disciples what she has seen, in verse 19 it says that on the evening of the first day of the first week, they are locked in a house for fear of the Jews. The disciples were not celebrating Mary's news. They were not out proclaiming the resurrection. They were locked in a room for fear of their lives because they thought they would be the next ones to die. And it isn't until Jesus shows up, until they see him with their own eyes, and he says, "Peace be with you," that they are able to rejoice. And even then, I would venture to say that they probably, for some of them, probably couldn't even believe what they were seeing, because some news is too good to be true, especially when you are in painful and dark moments in your life. And when you find yourself in those moments, it is easy to believe that all is lost. It is so easy to give in to your grief or your anger or your fear. It's incredibly difficult to see past or present circumstances to trust that all will be well in the end, that God really does have it all together and knows what God is doing. And those are the moments where we have to see it for ourselves in order to believe it. So that is the situation that the disciples were facing when we encounter Thomas in our gospel for today. Now, Thomas was a disciple who, for whatever reason, was not with the disciples locked in that room on the first Sunday evening. And so he hears about the resurrection and Jesus' appearances secondhand. And I have to say that I think it is terribly unfair that Thomas has gotten such a bad reputation all of these years for being doubting Thomas. That's typically what he's known for. Because really, Thomas was just expressing what any one of us would have expressed had we just been told that our best friend who had died had come back to life. And he says, these are the words he says, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Thomas verbalized his disbelief, but his response was, in essence, no different than the disciples that we read about in Luke last week. When the women came back and told them that Jesus was not in the grave, they thought it was idle tale. They thought they were making it up because some news is just too good to be true. And so a week later, Thomas finds himself with the disciples this time when Jesus appears to them again. And much to his amazement, Jesus doesn't scold Thomas for not being present the first time, and he doesn't scold him for his disbelief. He simply offers him an invitation. He offers him the very thing that Thomas said he needed in order to believe. Jesus says, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side." Now, it doesn't say whether Thomas actually puts out his hand to touch Jesus' wounds. Art throughout history has portrayed Thomas doing that and putting his finger in Jesus' side, but the text doesn't actually say that. But what we do know is that Jesus offered him an invitation. He offered him to come and see for himself, not to believe because other people had told him, but to come and taste and see for himself. And then in verse 27, he tells Thomas, "Do not doubt, but believe." Now, what is interesting is that as you read these first stories of Jesus' appearances post-resurrection, as one would expect, the word believe actually comes up time and time again, usually in relation to whether they believed that Jesus had been risen or whether they believed when other people told them that Jesus was risen. And in almost every single one of the cases where the word that we read in English is believe, the Greek word is a Greek word called pisteo, which usually is literally translated as believe or belief. But when Jesus tells Thomas here in verse 27, do not doubt, but believe, it's a different Greek word that is used there. The Greek word that is used there is pistos, which actually is more often than not translated as faithful. So what Jesus is asking Thomas right here is not, do not doubt, but believe. He's really asking him, do not doubt, but be faithful. He's not simply asking him to believe what he's seen and experienced in that room. He's asking him to be faithful to it, which at the end of the day is a much harder request. And I do believe it's the same request that Jesus makes to us some 2,000 years later as we ourselves are celebrating Easter. Because Easter still presents us with news that is too good to be true. God isn't finished yet. Love is stronger than death. Violence and evil may win in the short term, but they will never have the final word. And while this news is good news indeed, and it leaves us celebrating joyously on Easter morning, at times it can also be news that is very hard to swallow. Because the good news of Easter and the resurrection is not just that God's love is stronger than death. The good news of Easter is also that evil will never be overcome by more evil. Death will never be overcome by violence. As Martin Luther King so beautifully stated, darkness will not overcome darkness. Only light can do that. And hatred will never overcome hatred. Only love can do that. And so when we today are confronted with this good news of the gospel, this good news of Easter, we find ourselves responding the same way Thomas did. God, that's not possible. You don't understand. That's not how things work. Dead people don't come back to life. Violence is the best way to overcome evil. You clearly don't know what that person did to me, because if you did, you would not ask me to forgive them. And you clearly don't understand really what's going on in my life, because if you did, you'd know there's no second chances. There's no new life. There's no getting back up after this. And yet when we respond this way to Jesus in our disbelief, we see essentially what Thomas saw. We see Jesus extending his wounded hands out to embrace us and inviting us in to experience for ourselves the news of new life and grace and hope. And then Jesus offers us the same invitation, the same command that he offered Thomas. Do not doubt, but be faithful. Be faithful to my way of doing things, the good news that I have told you. Follow me. Not the world, not the way the world tells you to do things. Follow me and my way. And the thing is that until we experience that for ourselves, until we can taste and see and experience in our own flesh what the good news of the resurrection is, it'll always be easier to believe the world. It'll always be easier to give in to doubt, to hopelessness. In October of 2014, I took a group of people from Pasadena to Lineville, Alabama, to Servants in Faith and Technology. They are an organization that has a campus there, and they work with community development and leadership development all over the world. And so one of their graduates, we met that week, and his name is William. Now, William currently works in Uganda, running an orphanage for small boys, but William is from Rwanda, and he is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And so William told us this story of something that happened to his father when he was a young boy. And so William's father was a businessman in his village, and he owned a truck. And one day this truck was stolen from William's father. And customary practice in that village was that when something was stolen, if the thief was caught, it was up to the person they stole from to determine the punishment. And so this mob, this crowd of people, brings this man before William's father and says, "What do you want us to do with him?" And as William told this story, I found myself just thinking back and imagining the bloodthirst that was on their lips, how much they probably wanted to see revenge and see this guy get what was coming to him, much like we experienced on Good Friday. And William says that his father looked at the man and he looked at the crowd and he said this. He said, "I am a follower of Jesus, and God has forgiven me for a lot of things that I've done wrong in my life, and I cannot not forgive this man. Let him go." And that was impossible to believe. That was not how they did things in their village, but they had to let him go. And so fast forward several years, William's father was actually killed in the genocide along with his brother, and William is now a young man of about 18 years old, still in the throes of a war And at 18, William finds himself caught by the rival tribe and facing certain death. And he says that when they caught him, they told him, "Tonight we will make the river run red with your blood." And as William stood there, he said, a voice in the crowd spoke out and said, "One man's blood is not enough to turn the river red. Go find more and leave this man with me." And so the rest of the crowd leaves, and William is left facing this man who is certainly going to kill him. And the man asks him, "What is your name?" And he says, "My name is William." And he says, "What is your father's name?" And he told him, and he said, "That's what I thought. I'm the man that your father forgave all those years ago, and now I can finally pay him back." And so this man took William and hid him in his home for 3 days because he knew the rest of the crowd would come back wanting to know what had happened to him. He hid him in his house for 3 days, and then when he knew the crowd was gone and wouldn't look for him anymore, he helped him get to the border of Uganda and set him free. And William told us that night, he said, "Because my father was obedient to Jesus, my life was saved, and I am alive today." Friends, God calls us to be people of the resurrection. God calls us to be faithful to this news that seems too good to be true, that seems impossible to believe, because the world desperately needs this news, this good news. So I want to ask you this morning, how would your life be different tomorrow morning when you wake up if you really believed and were faithful to this good news? That Christ is alive, that God loves you, that God's grace is enough for you, and that you don't have to be afraid of death any longer. And not only that you don't have to be afraid of death, but you don't have to be afraid of living. You don't have to be afraid of what comes next in life. How would your life be different? And how would the world be different if we as a community, as a country, as a world, as a city, if we actually believed and were faithful to the news that hatred and violence are never the answer? If we were faithful to paths of reconciliation and kindness and forgiveness and listening and understanding that quite frankly seem impossible given our current political situation that we're facing in our country, how would the world be different? Because that kind of world, that is the world that God dreamed for us to live in, a world of impossibilities. That is the world that is made possible by the good news of the resurrection. Even when everything else in the world today and everything else up until this point in our lives tells us differently, that Resurrection Sunday, it changes everything for us because Christ is alive. God's love is stronger than death, and we don't have to be afraid anymore. And that, my friends, is news that is too good not to be true. So let us believe and rejoice and be faithful. Amen.